Hello, students. You are all welcome immensely. In last lecture, we discussed about realism and naturalism in fiction. In today's lecture, we will discuss about psychological fiction. The psychological novel is a form of novel in which character, especially the inner lives of a character, is the primary focus. It is traditionally understood as a genre of prose fiction that focuses intensively on the interior life of characters, representing their subjective thoughts, feelings, memories, and desires. While in its broad set usage, the term psychological novel can refer to any work of narrative fiction with a strong emphasis on complex characterization. It has been associated specifically with literary movements such as 19th century psychological realism, 20th century literary modernism, and the stream of consciousness novel, and with narrative techniques such as free indirect discourse and the interior monologue. The term psychological novel also refers to work of prose fiction that drawn upon contemporary psychological theories. Because the term is so flexible, there is little consensus about the origins of the psychological novel. Some trace are the jump back to the earliest origins of the novel itself. Others cite influences ranging from Cervantes' Don Quixote 1605 to 1615 to genres such as the historical romance, the sentimental novel, the epistolary novel, and the spiritual autobiography. Some of these diverse influences can be seen in psychological novels from the first half of the 19th century, including James Hogg, The Private Memoirs and Confession of a Justified Sinner, which makes extended to use of the doppelganger or a alter ego, and Stendhal's realist Bildungsroman Le Rough et le Noir in bracket Scarlet and Black. Regardless of its origins, by the second half of the 19th century, the psychological novel was flourishing. Fyodor Dostoevsky's novels constitute particularly influential examples of the genre. His intense psychological portrayals of suffering and despair were persecutors of 20th century existentialism, and his fictional legacy extends to authors as diverse as Marcel Proust, Albert Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre, Franz Kafka, James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, and William Faulkner. Leo Tolstoy was also crucial in the development of the psychological novel. His detailed observations of the inner lives of his characters had an impact on both 19th and 20th century practitioners of the genre. Anticipating modernist portrayals of subjectivity, both Tolstoy and Dostoevsky embedded internal monologues, direct representations of thought quotations from the mind of a character in the omniscient narrative structure of their fiction. Tolstoy's intimate and psychologically complex characterization were echoed in a wide range of 19th century novels that not only developed narrative techniques for the representation of human interiority but also reflected and contributed to psychological debates of the period. As recent critics have demonstrated, 19th century psychological novels explored new theories of emotion, attention habit, selfhood, memory, trauma, consciousness, and the unconscious. In particular, authors such as George Eliot and Henry James were central figures in the growth of the psychological novel and the rise of psychological realism in Britain and in America. Both authors drew upon their knowledge of the rapidly developing field of psychology to explore the inner lives and unspoken motivates of characters in works such as Eliot's Middlemarch and Jane and James' Portrait of a Lady. Their close family connections with two of the most respected psychologists of the period, George Henry Lewis, was unofficially married to George Eliot, and William James was Henry James' brother, further shaped Eliot's and James' engagements with contemporary psychologist theories. Tracing the psychology of characters through the use of free, indirect discourse and omniscient third person narration. Their narratives move subtly in and out of the minds of different characters to convey their feelings, thoughts, and perspectives, and to suggest the intricate relationship between mind and body, internal motivations, and external actions. In the process, Eliot and James put into practice some of the principles of 19th century psychological with emphasized the material basis of the mind. James' later novels are characterized by experimentation with points of views, interior monologues, and unreliable narrators. In works such as The Turn of the Screw, The Ambassador, The Golden Ball, James' indirect and often elusive prose style conveys what Sharon Cameron has called the omnipresence of consciousness. These works exemplify example exemplify not only James' intense psychological focus but also his experimentation with narrative techniques that link him to both the discourse of late Victorian psychology and the developments of modernism. While some style of psychological realism had begun to decline in popularity by the early 20th century, the psychological novel was far from having run its course. In 1907, Lecture had published as Creative Writers and Daydreaming. Sigmund Freud identified the psychological novels as a distinct genre in which the hero is described from within. The author sits inside his mind as it were and looks at the other characters from outside. The psychological novel, no doubt, owes its special nature to the inclination of the modern writer to split up his ego by self observation into many, drawing upon psychological theories of memory and consciousness. The psychological novel eventually became central to the development of literary modernism. The emergence of the memory sciences in the latter half of the 19th century, including French philosopher and psychologist Henry Bergson's identification of pure memories that are experienced involuntarily rather than intentionally recollected, coincident with a steadily increasing literary interest in portraying the unpredictable vagaries of memory and consciousness that had begun in the final decades of the 19th century. William James' analysis of desultory memory and the Lewis coinage of the term stream of consciousness corresponded to literary attempts to replicate the experience of consciousness, to convey its paradoxical combination of continuity and change through language. Early 20th century writers such as Marcel Proust, James Joyce, Dorothy Richardson, Virginia Woolf, and William Faulkner used their experiments in literary form with this new understanding. Although Proust, Richardson, and Joyce all published their groundbreaking narratives in the years between 1913 and 1915, Joyce's portrait offered the most radical departure from previous fictional forms, immersing the reader in the fragmented thoughts and memories of a child. Joyce's opening language provides no explanatory critical framework, no traditional narrative frame, no recognized entry point, only the abrupt immediacy of mental perception and sensations. Even more than the publication of portrait, however, the appearance of Joyce Ulysses in 1922 reconceived the psychological novel through its revolutionary linguistic rendering of the mind, tracing the labyrinth of consciousness through three central characters and transferring within the period of a single day. Thank you very much.